Okay, folks, I am Steve Mitchell. I'm the editor at Scuppernong Editions, which is a very small indie press here in Greensboro, North Carolina, that grew out of an independent bookstore called Scuppernong Books here in Greensboro. And we are happy to be sponsoring this event tonight on mixed edness, a conversation with David Wright Falade and Deonna Kelli Said. I'm going to be posting some links in chat as we proceed. So if you want to see those, you can open up your chat. You can also use chat to post comments or questions. You can do that during the conversation. And then toward the end of the event, we'll also open it up for questions and comments then, where you're welcome to unmute yourself and actually speak. So, Maura, you can keep your camera on. It's fine with us. Whatever you're comfortable with is fine. If you want to only see the speakers, if you haven't used Zoom before, you can go up to View, which is on the right side of your right top corner of your screen, and click on Speaker, and then you will only see the person who's speaking instead of the mosaic of everyone's face. So you can certainly do that. So let me tell you a little bit about the folks who are going to be speaking tonight, and then we'll get right down to it. Deonna Kelli Said is fifth generation Florida-born descendant of an indigenous Catawba family that helped settle a rural county in the Panhandle. Raised Southern Baptist, she became Muslim 25 years ago. Deonna has lived in the Middle East and Central Asia. Her work is featured online and in various anthologies, including Love Inshallah, The Secret Love Lives of American Muslim Women, and New Moons, Contemporary Writings by North American Muslims. Her essay, Contested Whiteness, True Tales of a White Muslim Woman, was made into an award-winning short film, Joe and the Shawl, by Nicole Bolivian. She is currently working on a novel set in North Florida that explores the Panhandle's historical, cultural, and racial hybridity. Deonna works for the North Carolina Writers Network, the state's largest literary arts nonprofit, and represents the PEN America North Carolina Piedmont chapter. David Wright Falade is the author of 3 books: the narrative history Fire on the Beach, recovering the lost story of Richard Etheridge and the Pea Island Lifesavers, and the novels Away Running and Black Cloud Rising, which was recently longlisted for the Cook's Corner Book Prize. The New Yorker chose Fire on the Beach as one of its notable selections, and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch named it one of the best books of 2001. Away Running was named an outstanding international book by the U.S. Board on Books for Young People and was selected by the Junior Library Guild and the Texas Library Association for its high school reading lists. An excerpt from Black Cloud Rising, entitled The Sandbanks 1861, appeared in the New Yorker, as did his most recent essay, The Truth About My Father, which was published in the New Yorker just a week or two ago. A former Fulbright Fellow to Brazil, David Wright Falade is the 21-22 Mary Ellen von der Hayden Fellow of the New York Public Library's Coleman Center for Writers. His work has been recognized by the Zora Neale Hurston Richard Wright Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Texas Institute of Letters. He teaches in the MFA program at the University of Illinois. Please welcome David Wright Falade and Deonna Kelli Said.
Thank you.
Silent snaps from everyone.
Yes.
So now I'm going to turn it over to Deonna.
Thank you, Steve, and thank all of you for taking time out of your evening to be with us tonight. If you are so inclined, it would be nice to know where you are Zooming in from. You can just put that in the chat. I'm in Greensboro, North Carolina. David, where are you?
I'm in Austin, Texas.
Wow. Okay. Well, nice to see you again. We met at Greensboro Bound, which was what, a month ago or something like that?
Yeah, that's right. A month and a half, maybe.
Yeah. And your panel was fabulous. And that's when I first
Thank you.
encountered your book. And I want to tell you how much I value learning about a part of North Carolina history that I did not know. And also how you bring into conversation some aspects of Americanness in your novel. So if you want to start us off by telling us a little bit about what the novel is and why you chose to write it.
Yeah, the novel's called Black Cloud Rising. It came out in February. And it's an historical novel. It's taken from an actual historical event where towards the beginning of the Civil War, the Union Army sort of had a stronghold in Tidewater, Virginia, and in coastal North Carolina. And at that point began raising troops amongst former slaves. Slaves fled behind Union lines immediately, and they started raising regiments of troops. At the very beginning, they imagined them as just labor, but this abolitionist general from Brookline, Massachusetts, Edward Augustus Wilde, who was super appropriately named because he was just a zealot in everything he did. I think Wilde and I think John Brown. He wanted to arm his regiment, and when he was able to procure arms for them, he led them on a foray back into North Carolina that was pretty much held by guerrilla units. That's where the former slaves had fled from. So they were going along and they were freeing friends and family. So it was this 3-week raid in December 1863 where these men are running home. That's the story. But the thing that interested me was mixedness, which is to say, this is starting to be a long-winded answer. I'll be briefer, or more brief. I'm not sure what is grammatically correct. This novel comes out of a story that I encountered when I was doing the research for my first book. The person at the center of that is Richard Etheridge, who was the first keeper of the only all-black Coast Guard station. It was called the Life Saving Service in the early Coast Guard. In doing research about Etheridge, I found all this interesting information about him after the war. But as I was discovering things about him before the war, it was pointing to really intriguing things, but there was just not documentations because he had been a slave. And so what I couldn't do was explore an aspect of his upbringing, which seemed highly likely, but that I couldn't definitively prove, which is to say that he was his master's son. All evidence seems to point to that, but it wasn't clear. And so I got the idea for this novel in part because I wanted to explore that relationship. As Richard Etheridge, as a soldier, is marching home, he's marching home to confront his father, right, who's his former owner. And so that notion of racial mixing, how it expressed itself then, how it made those relationships complicated, was part of what I wanted to get at with this novel.
Do you want to start off with reading a short excerpt?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'll read a really short excerpt from the beginning. And just to set it up, well, first to set it up, for those of you who knew me from Carleton, I need glasses now. I am an old man.
Oh, no, you're not.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, but yes, I am. So this is from the opening chapter, and before they were called the African Brigade. Before the African Brigade sets off into North Carolina, when they first get arms, they do a sort of test run, for lack of a better word, which is to say, General Wilde takes one of his companies, in which Richard Etheridge is a sergeant, out to a neighboring farm where it's a plantation. It's Union occupied, but there are still plantations around with slaves. This particular plantation owner is reputedly a rebel guerrilla. And so they do this company does this foray out from Fortress Monroe, Portsmouth, Norfolk, Virginia. They're going to march out to this farm and arrest this Confederate guerrilla. I'll pick it up at the moment where they've arrived at the farm. They've announced herself. This Confederate guerrilla comes out on his porch and, sort of stands up and declares, I'm in charge of the, home guard here, the Pungo Raiders they're called. And his slaves are it's early in the morning, his slaves are sort of falling out of their slave cabins. And General Wilde announces that he's, under arrest and that they're going to confiscate his property. And Richard Etheridge is the narrator. I was directing some men loading a handcart with farm tools when I overheard the runaway, who was a runaway who gave them the intelligence about this man. When I overheard the runaway Cuffy saying to the general, "All slavers buck they slaves." His head was bowed, but his voice clear and strong. But this one, he in the habit of stripping him head to heels, gals as likely as men's, whatever the age and for the least offense. And he lay it on sportly. The general's expression did not change, but something was moving underneath. "I know of at least one that ain't survived it," said Cuffy. And I noted then what aforehand I had failed to see, a whipping post, well used, standing erect between the dwelling house and the barn. Or what was more likely, my eyes had until then dodged seeing it. I had never suffered the lash, but what slave did not know it? General Wild, come abreast of the rebel Clapson, still disdainful of dismounting, leaned low from his saddle. "Even the women," said he, "even the women?" Sergeant Revere yanked Clapson to his feet, unbidden by the general, but the order clear. The Secesh pulled like a colt then, knowing certain what was next. Revere, with a fistful of hair and a fistful of cloth, dragged him toward that upright timber. Shackles hung from its foretop point, and while two troopers wrestled the man's lurching and writhing, Revere hitched him on by the wrists. The yard was dead still, us colored, slave as well as soldier, watching on. Mrs. Clapson's mouth lay wide open, lips a-quiver, but no sound came forth. Their three little boys, though, each one wailed. The general marched his mount to the barn and into it, then returned with a bullwhip over the pommel of his saddle. He rode it over to Revere. Clapson yanked at his wrist, crying to be released, all plea and no protest now. "Pungo raiders," said the general. How quaint. And with this, Revere, again obliging some unspoken command, lit the air with that long leather hide. Once, and again. Corporal Fields was then aside me, and I'd not heard him come up. "Damn, Richard," he said. "Damn." It was neither pity nor pleasure in his voice, just blunt astonishment. For who among us could have imagined this? The bottom rail on top, a nigger flogging a legal white man. The general bid Revere to stop just 4 lashes along. Clapson's head slumped low, his lips whimpering curses. The general prepared to address us troopers gathered around, or so we initially thought. In fact, he was speaking at them others. "Ladies," said he, his voice musical with sympathetic timbre, "I won't ask that you disclose this man's blasphemies against your virtue. Instead, I present the chance to settle old scores." The yard stood still. Even Clapson's sons had ceased to wail. From the crowd emerged an old mammy, head wrapped in a red rag, cheekbones like straight razors, a burlap dress hanging as long and plumb as her own long self. She crossed to the post, a deliberate stride that made the 30-odd paces seem a damn sight more distant. When she got there, she unfastened a tie and the topmost burlap dropped to the waist. Dugs as flat as griddle cakes lay like sad folds of flesh against her chest. It didn't seem she retained a tooth in her head. "This here the only virtue of being a Clapson nigger," said she, her voice gravel and as purposeful as her movements. She turned, and her back was a tangle of fleshy welts. "Ain't aught left here to blaspheme, I suppose. But I expect I might take you up on that score in bit. Mass Clapson's come up is long due." The general took the coiled cowhide from Revere and handed it to the old mammy. She let it out along the ground, reckoning the proper distance. Once she'd settled onto the right spot, the cowhide sang. And then I heard the rest, the other slaves cheering, troopers too. I heard Mrs. Clapson's rejoined wailing, her children's, and the rebel Clapson begging, "Mercy, Jenny, oh mercy." Vengeance can be justice, well earned and meted out fairly, and yet it be vengeance all the same. The cowhide sang, and I'll stop there.
Was that a hard scene to write?
It really wasn't. It's an actual event. I got really lucky in doing the research. I'd done a lot of the research for Fire on the Beach, my first book. But then as I came back, as I wanted to sort of flesh out this story, and Fire on the Beach, the events I describe in this novel are like 10 pages. There wasn't a whole lot that had been done. When I returned 15 years later, there was just a lot more work that had been done. And some of it I stumbled upon by chance. And one was this exact event. And it turned out it was by, in fact, this regiment. So even if it hadn't been, I would have gone, whoa, that's kind of awesome. That would work well in my novel. But it turned out it was also by General Wild. He took a company out from Fortress Monroe. And so there was a description of the event. It was much more bare. But as soon as I was reading about it, reading the article and then going to the source material, it just kind of came alive. If Richard Etheridge is wrestling with his paternity, which he is, what happens beyond where I stopped reading, he starts imagining his own mother and his father strung to that post. And so it seemed like the perfect launch point for this novel that's about this event, which is to say going back into North Carolina, but also about the thing that Richard Etheridge is wrestling with, you know, his obligation to his family, which in theory by the mores, or the conventions is a better word, by the conventions of slavery, had treated Richard pretty well, right? They taught him to read and write. He was treated better than other slaves, but he was still a slave. And he also understood how he came to be, which is to say, you know, his father had at some point raped his mother. So all that sort of conflict, I wanted to try to, I didn't know how to open the book, and suddenly I stumbled upon this event, and it seemed like an appropriate one.
Richard Etheridge has a pull on you. It has a hold on you. I've heard you talk. We talked about it in personal conversations. You've mentioned it on NPR. There's something that intrigues you about Richard Etheridge. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, and it ties to this recent piece in the New Yorker, Mixed, which is, you know, about my own sort of conflicted paternity, and it's nothing I was thinking about explicitly. It was actually when the excerpt from the novel came out in the New Yorker, the editor did an interview that's like there, and she's asking about the source material and about the story and about the novel and all that, and I'm talking about it. And then at one point, she made the connection between me and my own sort of conflicted paternity, sort of conflicted history with several fathers, and Richard Etheridge and his. And I realized that that's part of it. That's part of it, sort of, you know, daddy issues or whatever. But even more so, or at least as much, Richard Etheridge as a figure, for me, is this forgotten hero, right? What Fire on the Beach describes is this man who had been a slave, fights in the Civil War, comes back. The United States government creates a life-saving service, the early Coast Guard. At first, there are very few blacks in the service. This is during the Reconstruction, after the Civil War. A handful, and they're all in North Carolina stations in what were called checkerboard crews. But the blacks in service were always the lowest people on the duty roster. They were ranked number 5 and number 6. Richard Etheridge is number 6 at a neighboring station, but he's generally known to be one of the best watermen out there. When he's given an opportunity to lead a station, because the service was really poorly run at that point, he understood it, and the life-saving service understood it as the only way to keep blacks in the service, because they were, after the end of Reconstruction, they weren't being hired anymore. So Richard Etheridge being hired, he hires black surfmen. So segregation serves this sort of ironic purpose. It's a source of opportunity. Otherwise, blacks won't be in the service at all. Richard Etheridge takes that on. 8 months after, the station is burned to the ground, right? He stays. They rebuild the station. And then they serve heroically he dies in the station 20 years later. And the station remains all black until after World War II, when those stations are decommissioned. And he also leads this tremendous rescue in 1896, when he's 56 years old, 57 years old, when the crews to the north and left have quit their stations, and there's a ship comes ashore. It's during a hurricane, So that's why the other crews had left their stations. Richard Etheridge goes abreast. He leads his crew down the beach. They are abreast of the station, of the ship. They can see it. They can hear the mariners who are, crying and rejoicing because, aid has arrived, but they can't use their equipment because it's a hurricane and the sea is overwashing the beach, right? Instead of sort of giving up and waiting for, half dead people or dead people to wash ashore, Richard Etheridge gets two of his men. They tie a line between them, and those men swim out to the ship. So they rescue all the people on board without the use of their equipment. That's heroic. So on the one hand, he's this heroic person that we've forgotten, and his story is complicated because of his mixed background, right? He gets certain favors. He's in the life-saving service in part because he's an Etheridge, right? Not a black Etheridge, but a white Etheridge. But he's still a black man, so he's the lowest man on the roster. When he gets an opportunity, he takes most advantage. But the person who burns the station down is his cousin, right? Who wanted that position, his white cousin. So all that complexity of interracial relationships, for me, is what I was writing about with Black Cloud Rising. It was what I was trying to explore. Patrick, the person who 20 years later is going to burn the station down, is a character in the novel. Because what did it look like when they were kids and they were friends, right? At what point do they stop becoming friends? Does Patrick understand that in the same way that Richard does? Those sorts of questions I just found interesting. And at this point, I don't even think I'm answering your question anymore. So I apologize. I'm totally rambling.
You're not, but it was all very fascinating. But I do want to talk a little bit about, well, I want to actually talk a lot about this because this is something that's on my mind a lot. We're at a moment in American history where there's a struggle for who gets to tell the story of America. And you and I are of the mind that America has been mixed from the point of first contact. From the moment that colonists arrived on this continent and interacted with indigenous people, America became culturally and racially mixed. And it's a story that some Americans are deeply, deeply uncomfortable with, but it's the truth. And you have a very interesting personal story that has informed the way that you understand your Americanness. Do you want to tell a little bit briefly about your background, your parentage? I know you do talk about it in the most recent New Yorker essay, but just bring everyone up to speed.
Yeah. I grew up David Wright, and my mother was a Holocaust survivor. She was born in 1931 in France. She was a French Jew, but she married a GI in the 50s and came to a black GI in the 50s and came to the United States. Was here for about 4 or 5 years, and then they were stationed back in France. My older sister Miriam was born, and then I was born, and we came back to the States. As far as I know, my father retired from the Army. We lived in Kansas City. My growing up is basically me understanding myself as being, Black, American, biracial, but the one-drop rule in the era which I grew up, still today to some extent, just meant that I was Black. And so that's how I identified, and I understood myself to be the descendant of slaves, and that was really, that informed my growing up in any number of ways. When I was 16, my mother told me that, in fact, my father was this African man that she had grown up with after the war. She had been involved in the anti-colonial movement. She was communist during the Communist Party. Her experience during the war and surviving the war led her to be really sort of outraged, rebellious, pushing against things. And so she embraced the Communist Party, the anti-colonial movement, fell in love with this man who was an African from Benin. It was Dahomey. And then they, broke up, young couples do all the things that young couples do, and had this sort of ugly breakup, which is when she sort of precipitously married the Black GI, Bayless Wright, who I thought was my father. When they're back in France in the early 60s, she had an affair then with the African man. And that's how I came to be born. So she told this to me at 16. But this African man, it turns out, is descended from the last kings of Dahomey. And the kings of Dahomey for 160 years were sort of prominent slave traders from the slave coast. It was a kingdom, a legacy, a dynasty again, 150-year dynasty built on the back of slavery, which is to say, raiding into neighboring villages, into neighboring towns. They developed a professional army that was built around this, and they provided, slaves to the coast that were then sold to Europeans. My image growing up was that, it was like roots, like, white people came and they raided for slaves and they took them across the sea. But in fact, as often as not, even more often, it was these African kingdoms who were, using slavery as a way to, on the one hand, secure themselves, if you're not fighting others and you're maybe being fought, but also to modernize. They're getting European goods by trading slaves. I'm not saying this as a way to justify it, but as a way to try to explain it. So I went from learning that I was the descendant of slaves to I was the descendant of slave traders. And so that's basically the story I tell. I tell it hopefully better than I just did. But yeah, that's sort of the backstory.
How did you rectify that? And I will say I have some sense of how that may feel. I'm descended from an Indigenous person who was actually an Indian scout for Andrew Jackson, who helped clear Creek and Seminole people from Florida. And Andrew Jackson, in my mind, was he committed genocide. And I'm descended from someone who is Indigenous but helped him do that. So there is this weight that sometimes one feels knowing that I survived, my family survived because of decisions that an ancestor made. And it does weigh heavy. And I'm just curious if there was what kind of process did you go through to sit with this new information, to absorb it into your personhood?
Part of it is this work that I'm trying to do with Black Cloud Rising, or with the essay Mixed-ed, which is to say, what interests me or drew me to writing, to try to be a writer, was the gray, human complexity. Like, just from my own life, even, I started writing after I graduated college. Terrible poetry. And then I started trying to write some stories and whatever. But what interested me all along was sort of human complexity as myself. I was understanding it. This Black kid I graduated college in 1986, at a moment when sort of the after effects of the civil rights movement and of the Black arts movement are starting to take hold. Toni Morrison, these writers are coming on the scene. Spike Lee is making these movies. We're starting to get representations of Blackness that are super important and that are valorizing about how I'm thinking about Blackness, about myself as a Black person. But it also feels like something is not being, as I learn more about myself, it feels like parts of that story are not being told. But it also feels like it's, especially sort of post-Black arts. And again, this is not criticism, it's observation. It seems like it was necessary to happen, but what happens is suddenly Black folks are telling Black stories and it starts feeling balkanized in a way. Black people can tell Black stories, white people can only tell white stories. And that doesn't feel like it is fundamentally what America is about. Like you said, among the first laws passed in the Virginia colony was anti-miscegenation laws, right? Because they bring 20 slaves over in 1619, and very soon, slaves are making babies with indentured servants, right? Slaves are marrying indentured servants. And that's a threat to the ruling powers, right? Bacon's Rebellion shows this to us. Those folks unite on the quote, the edge of the quote frontier to fight Native Americans who are there. But what the sort of ruling elite recognizes is they're way outnumbered, and they've against an antagonistic group based upon class. And so they begin to divide them racially. Mixedness is there. On the edge of the frontier also, Black folks and indentured servants are intermarrying with Native Americans. They're creating communities. So if at heart Americanness is about mixedness, I didn't understand, and I don't understand, how I can tell a story about America or Americanness where that complexity isn't there. As a writer, I mean, as a thinker, I think I just don't think well in abstraction, and I could never write a book, an academic book about this. And and I probably couldn't read one very well either. Again, I just don't work well with abstraction and theory and things like that. But I felt like there were good stories to tell. And so if I can tell a good story and create complicated characters that are addressing these issues, then I think that's an opportunity for us to have conversations like this that I think are important, because I think we need to be able to speak across race.
Yeah. I agree with
And
you. And I
class.
think at this moment, these stories are so important because there seems to be a certain group of people that are really investing in race in a very constricted, violent way, when that just isn't. I mean, race has been central to American identity from day one, but so has mixedness. And the mixedness is not showing up in how we talk about our American identity. But I have two questions I want to ask you, and then hopefully people can share some of their experiences or thoughts. I know you had what I call your James Baldwin years in Europe and France. And you told me that you planned to leave and probably not come back to America. And while you were there, you had a realization that you were an American. And I want you to tell me how that realization happened and what does that mean? Like, what does Americanness mean? Because I sure as hell don't know right now.
Yeah. Yeah. So after the year after I graduated, I worked in the admissions office. And I think like probably most 21, 22-year-olds, you're trying to find yourself in some way, what it is you want to do in the world. And I didn't have a whole lot of idea. And that's when I started writing. I tried to act. I was a pretty terrible actor. I bought a guitar that I 20 years later just took to Goodwill because I still couldn't play it. Stuff like that. I was trying, there was something that was sort of boiling inside that I needed to find expression for. But I was also outraged. I was reading Baldwin, and the outrage he was expressing, this is in mid-1980s. I'm reading these essays he's written in the 50s and 60s, and I'm feeling a similar sort of outrage. And so in a play I was in, a guy I was in a play with told me that they had American football in England. He had it brought back a poster, and I'd played football. And so I was like, I called them on the phone. I was like, hey, I'm a football player. And they were like, come over, we'll give you a tryout. And I remember reading Baldwin had left the country with $40, and I had $400. That seemed maybe an appropriate equivalent. And I got a one-way ticket, and I just went. England was interesting. But when I got to France about 7 months later, and I'm living in Paris, and again, really an anger that is there. And in my mind, I'm an expatriate. I'm leaving. I'm going to find a way to get to Africa, to sort of travel as much as I can and figure out what it is I'm going to do in the world once this football thing stops, because football's paying the bills. It's fun too, but it's paying the bills. Especially in France more than England. It started in England some, but especially in France. So one of the teams I was on, the second team I was on, it was sort of highlighted. Like we were in this, it was a team that was from this poor neighborhood in northern Paris. The 2005 Paris riots, they didn't start there, but that's where they got really escalated. So it's a very diverse community. The French describe it as a mostly sort of North African Muslim community, but super mixed. The thing that most people have in common is relative poverty. So it's super mixed racially, ethnically, but fairly poor. And consequently, politics works different in France. It's a left politically township. And so the local government is communist. And what the communist township decided to do, they created this American football team as an outlet for young men and boys, this semi-professional team. You can only have X number of Americans on a team, 3 at that point. So I'm playing on this team that has the uniforms of the Pittsburgh Steelers, but a hammer and sickle on the side of the helmet, And as I'm there as a Black American, and I'm living in Paris, I'm taking the subway back and forth with the RER back and forth. One of my teammates is French Canadian. We have to be really close. And he tells me, it's typical for me to get used to being pulled over and ask for my ID papers. He told me that he's lived in France 5 years longer than me. He's like, this has never happened to me until I was hanging out with you. Because people are seeing me and identifying me as Black or North African at the police. And so they're singling me out in this way. But even that, I had such a privilege. When I showed them the American passport, they let me go. I was on my way. And that was so different from what those young men and the boys, from our junior team were experiencing in this suburb. And so recognizing that privilege, the fact that as a Black American, I was somehow differently colored from French colored folks, made me want to think about it differently, or forced me to think about it differently. But also, just me juxtaposed to your typical French person was just different. I learned a lot about myself, and a lot of things that the French do, I valued about how they sort of understood themselves in society and whatever, about how they interacted in society on some level, but sort of forcing then to sort of see myself through that lens the longer I lived there. And especially as I got to know my African family, made me sort of go, yeah, I'm kind of American. I can be as outraged as I want to be. I can feel as much an expatriate as I want to feel. But at the end of the day, no matter the fact that my mother's French and my father was African, that I'm living abroad, that most of the people I'm with are not American, my Americanness stood out all the more. And it stood out in ways that were interesting to me. So
yeah, I do think that for me, I've lived abroad, and I've lived and had to operate in different cultures that has made me value that one of the strongest parts of being an American is our globality, that we are connected to the globe. We have been. We're a society that has been developed by global forces, and this is probably one of our strongest assets. But right now, that particular asset is really being challenged, and we're kind of closing ranks, like we're becoming more nativistic. And some people are becoming more nativistic in how they understand American identity. And that could be to our detriment. I feel, and not everyone may agree with me, that could be to our detriment. But I do want to ask you, because it's a question I struggle with. For you, what is Americanness?
for me, Americanness is mixedness. And on every level, not just Black, white, but as concerns ethnicities, as concerns people marry across gender, this has always been the case, but we're an open embracing of it, or at least an effort to openly embrace it. Across races, across ethnicities, across religions, across those lines. It has always happened with resistance, because this myth of the myth upon which Americanness is constructed is so narrow, right? The founding fathers, quote unquote, the founders use grand language, freedom, liberty, this and that, but it's only for themselves. And not even just white men. In the Constitution, as they write it, specifically for white men with property. So there's a class element. But Americanness from the beginning, like we talked about those first laws when Virginia is an English colony, are anti-miscegenation laws. On some level, for a variety of complicated reasons, not always noble, but people in this space that that we colonized and conquered have mixed. And I think the tension is a refusal to acknowledge it, to acknowledge it, and not even just acknowledge it, embrace it. One little anecdote that comes up, I actually constructed a class around it. Late 19th century, 1870s forward, roughly, ragtime explodes, not just in the United States, but in the world. And from this global view, people elsewhere are looking at, are embracing ragtime music and are going, this is uniquely American. People around the globe are recognizing this as only possible here in the United States. And because of the mixed roots of it, in America, not so much, but around the globe, we recognize it that way, or it's being recognized that way. And as ragtime gains in popularity here, and it gets hugely popular across class lines too, because Scott Joplin, who's one of the fathers of ragtime, was a trained musician. So ragtime is music played mostly by Black musicians in brothels in the South, right? But Scott Joplin is a trained musician, so he writes the sheet music and sells it. And so suddenly middle-class families in the middle of nowhere are playing ragtime music, and it spreads around the globe. The thing that's interesting to me about that is not just that globally people are looking at this and going, this is uniquely American. The fact of its unique Americanness isn't that it's Black, because it's not. The musical tradition that it's relying upon are some Black musical traditions, but it's on a European instrument, right? That's mixedness. And that's what interests me. So it's not just that Scott Joplin, a Black man, sort of had this ingenious thing and people are going, they perceive themselves as, it's called Negro music. They perceive it that way. But if we think about what it is, in fact, it's a hybrid.
Mhm.
It's mixed. It's American. And so I think that's, yeah, I think it's important to recognize that. I'm not sure I answered your question again. I started thinking about ragtime. Sorry.
Yeah, I think you did. And one last question, and then hopefully people will start putting comments or questions into the chat. We can open it up for a larger discussion. As much as I believe in the hybridity that is America, the racial and cultural hybridity that's in the DNA of this country, like I said from the very beginning, we are at a moment where some people really need to essentialize race, both white people and Black people and other people. They need to have that essentialization, and mixedness challenges that. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and you and I have talked about this, and some days I wake up feeling, closer to Martin, and some days I wake up feeling closer to Malcolm. And I'm not sure what I'm feeling today. But when I'm most hopeful, when I'm feeling Martin and I'm most hopeful, I understand this moment as a backlash, because that resistance has existed from the beginning, like we were just talking about. And violence has always been a character of it. It's always been a characteristic of it, a trait of it. These sorts of, that sort of resistance has always been enforced through violence. I'm not saying that as a way to discount it at all. What I do mean to say is that it's not new. And so the question I ask myself is especially the last 6 years, sort of the 2016 election on, is that a backlash to Obama? Which it feels like on some level. And part of the backlash then is this sort of, a president who enabled a resurgence of this sort of violent sort of nativism and small-minded view of Americanness. Again, on my good days, that's what I think it might be, and I hope it is, but I'm not sure. I do know this. I think I know this anyway. As much as political forces are trying to unwind, and in fact are unwinding things, Roe v. Wade, it's hard to take away people's rights when they've had rights, and especially in a country that's built on violence. And so I'm not saying this is a good thing. I'm just saying that I don't know how it's going to continue to express itself, but I don't, whether it's a backlash or just sort of an inherent nativism that was inevitable to resurge, I don't think it will sit easily going forward. The one thing that scares me in that scenario, and this is the last thing I'll say, because I want folks to jump in, the more immediate threat is the challenges to democracy. Because as long as we have something approximating a democracy, the more that people have been enfranchised, then those voices will be expressed. Mm-hmm. But the trend that we're seeing since, I was just reading about this in the Times, really in the past 20 years from these sort of international studies that have been sort of, researching sort of democracies and sort of grading them, we have had our democracy has been more in jeopardy for about the past 20 years. And as voices are silenced, that's where I think the real problem lies. So.
Yeah, I agree. And that's where I feel now is the time, as writers, as cultural creatives, artists, actors, whatever we do, that it is essential that we, I want to say, deconstruct the old stories, that we make room for new stories that are actually the true stories of this country. And I honestly believe that democracy depends on it.
Absolutely.
That is our task as writers. I'm speaking for myself. You don't have to agree with me, all the writers out there, but I do feel that my task as a cultural creative is to try to unearth these stories, because this is part of the real stories of America. Sarah Mason has pointed out something wonderful. She said Rhiannon Giddens makes similar case about strong band music in her BBC podcast, Black Roots. Yes, she's a North Carolina native. Shout out to Rhiannon. Actually, she's here from Greensboro, and she's here sometimes. Joanne just finished Juneteenth with the mixedness of the birth of this country to all points is the truth of this nation. Hallelujah. Tonight's talk enhances this great discussion touching upon my own. Oh, Joanne, hi, I know you. You're glad to see you're here. I was just telling David that I wanted to introduce the two of you. Hi. Absolutely. Wide embrace. Then Manu, David, what is Africa to you? I know that you have been reading Judith Gleason's historical novel, A Go Time, Her Legend. Would you care to say something about that?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that question, Manu. I'll start maybe a little abstract. Africa is really personal. It's really familial. But what I understand about myself is that I'm not African, despite the fact that my father and my father's family is, and I've been embraced in this family now. It was a rough journey to get there. But I'm not African broadly. On the one hand, Africa is a continent, but even Daomean, like I could have Daomean citizenship. Benin as it's called now. But what I understand is that, like, it's interesting, and this may be, Manu, I know you're in Accra, and I've spent a little time in Ghana. And one of the things that was wonderful about my experience there was sort of the way that, at least in my experience there, I was embraced. I loved, I'm drawing a blank, Sadiya Hartman's book about her experience in Ghana, because I had some of that conflicted experience too. But in Ghana, there was this sort of, at least on a superficial level, embracing. In Benin, not so much. Like, Beninese people have a different relationship to the slave trade. I've been to sort of Cape Coast Castle and Elmina, and there's a whole tourist industry around it that's sometimes uncomfortable, but at least there's at least some conversation about it. In Benin, it's more complicated. And even as I embrace my family and my familial relationship to Benin, it's hard for me to settle with the fact of our implication, our role, more than our implication, our role in the slave trade, my sort of familial role in the slave trade. So I want to explore it. I want to ask questions about it, but I understand myself more as American. And just one final sort of point on it. Part of this is also in reaction to my family, my grandfather and my father, who I would never, it would be wrong to say that they were proud about sort of our heritage as slave traders. But there was a pride in their place in Benin, their status and stature in Beninese society. And that is necessarily related to the fact that we are the descendants of slave trading kings. And my father actually, as often as not, is when he spoke about the United States, generally it was with a negative sort of tinge, about Black Americans too. I also expected when I'd be in conversations with them, for them to express some sort of, if not guilt, remorse. And there was none there. And so even though in my blood, that is my blood tie, there's a part of me that's more American than that blood tie because of my upbringing, and maybe just because of how I situate myself morally in the universe. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm answering your question, Manu, but I hope so, a little bit.
Daryl has a great question. To Deonna, you referenced a nativist streak that attempts to claim Americans. Is that not in part the same attempt to head off class conflict by interjecting race, as David referenced in colonial Virginia? I'm not sure who the question is for, but I'm going to let David answer that.
Well, I want you to answer it first, if you don't mind.
Yeah, yes, I definitely think class is part of it. Where I am right now as an American is that we have an unresolved, we are telling lies about the history of race in this country. We are not confronting the history of race because we do not have the tools to do it as a society. And if we had to confront the violence that this country was built on against Indigenous people, brown and Black bodies, it would probably destroy a lot of Americans because we just don't know how to rebuild other stories around that. For me, class has grown out of race, but I know other people have different theories about that.
Yeah, for me, and the question about class is really central. Having grown up, sort of sometimes middle class, sometimes working class, and there were periods where we were very poor. Well, let me start someplace else, because to me, it's a personal question, but it's also my understanding of history, which is to say, America pretends to not be a classed society, and it very, from its founding, this sort of notion of equality. But again, the only people who could vote were white male property owners. So it's a classed society, and part of the conflict is those with resources being forced, sometimes a little bit willingly, but as often as not being forced to share them, sort of transcending class boundaries. And because race was used to divide classes, those two are inextricably tied. With that said, when I look at some of our contemporary problems that surround race, I mean, they pertain to me in that I could walk in, I'm in Austin, Texas, I'm in Texas. I could, go to a protest and end up on the wrong side of a gun. Or I could be driving down the street and end up on the wrong side of a police stop. I don't deny that at all. But way overwhelmingly, the Black folks and the brown folks and the Native folks who are the victims of that sort of societal, those sorts of societal injustices are poor people, right? It's intertwined with the fact of poverty or of lesser access to resources. Because from my vantage point, this is my sort of take, because we have because the free market is a religion to us, because we put so much emphasis on the free market, and we sort of have learned to, over centuries, demonize poverty. And so race and class are inextricably tied, and folks of color tend to be disproportionately the victims of it. But class is the weapon that is still used to, provoke so much of the societal animus that leads to violence, that results in violence. So yeah.
Yeah. I don't want to take too much of people's time, but we would love to hear from you. And I'm personally interested, David, if you don't mind, if I can ask those in attendance, like, what is Americanist to you? You can either put it in the chat or you can speak it. We don't mind hearing your voices at all. I don't expect anyone to have an immediate answer, because it's a really, when you start to think about it, I don't know if anyone has an immediate answer. If you do, like, accolades to you, but if you feel compelled to write about what American is to you, and if you happen not to be in America, if you want to share what your perception of Americanness is, I would also love to hear it. What are you working on now, David?
A novel that's based on that love triangle between a character based upon my mother, a character based upon Jack Wright, the man who I thought was my father, and a character based upon Falade, who was my biological father, set in post-war Paris. So not sort of the scope of all that history. I don't figure into it at all, but really those three young people in that moment after the war, when all three of them are outraged for different reasons, and the world seems possible for remaking, right? I mean, the world seems like possibility. So that's the new novel that, if I'm lucky, knock on wood, I'll finish in the next 8 months or so. I've been working on it for a long time.
Wow. You just said something that's really interesting to me, that a new world is possible. I think as an American, I always felt that until about 6-7 years ago. And now I'm not so sure.
Sarah typed in the chat an interesting. Do you mind if I read it?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not an American, but have lived here 40 years. I think Americanness is a mindset of expectation of being able to pursue one's dreams, desires, and goals uninhibited. I think that's absolutely true. I think that's one of the things that living abroad, in France specifically, but in England too. England felt caste bound. It felt class bound. I was on this American football teams with guys, I was 22, with guys who were my age, who've been working at the Penguin Book Factory, sort of, doing stock and stuff like that for 6 years because they had done what were called O levels as opposed to A levels, where there's this expectation you're going to go to college. And these guys were inevitably sort of working class guys. And as we were, again, because we're a similar age, we're getting to be friends. They never had it. Some of them really sharp, some of them bookish even. You know, they work at the Penguin Factory, they're reading books and whatever, but they just never had any expectations that they might leave that caste. And for me, who grew up working class and sometimes poor, but I was always told I was going to college, I did feel like I had that possibility, you know, despite the fact of racism in America and whatever. So I think there is an element of it. For me, from my vantage point, what ends up being frustrating is how policies and structures and institutions create limitations for us, delimit it for us. So we have this rhetoric that is important, and then these barriers that we overcome eventually, so far, many of them, but not always. So, or maybe we're still working at it. If I'm feeling more Martin than Malcolm.
So we're coming up on an hour. Again, if someone really has something to say, please do say it. What advice, I hate these questions, I can't believe I'm asking you the question, but for someone who is a writer or an emerging writer, and I know we do have many writers in the room tonight, who are working on a novel maybe that just is taking forever, what is some of the, this is the question, what is some of the best writing advice that you have ever received?
It's not advice I received per se, but it's advice that I teach in an MFA program. And so I'm talking to you know, young aspiring writers all the time. And so it's advice that I give. And if I ever received it, it wasn't as directly as this. But I think what makes for, I mean, we all write. If you're keeping a journal, if you're doing whatever, or not all, but many of us, you know, if you're keeping a journal or whatever, even if you're an active letter writer with your friends and your family, you're writing, you're expressing something that is there that needs expression. And the more you do it, you're probably doing it in a way that it isn't just sort of like, got up today, had some coffee, went to work. You know, you're really trying to get at something. I think, so I'm drawing that distinction to say, if the aim is to be a professional writer, not necessarily, I can't pay my bills with my writing. You know, I get lucky every now and then and land a piece here or there, but I've got to teach, right? But I am a professional writer, and that writing means something to me in that way. I want to be able, I don't want to just write it in my journal. I want y'all to read it and to react to it, to have a reaction, to think about it. And the best advice I can give for that is just stick-to-itiveness. You know, at Carleton, where I went to college with a couple of folks who've come in today, I majored in French in part because I thought I was really smart in math, and that was immediately disproved fall term freshman year when I almost failed the class. And then I started taking English classes, so I'm starting to read and going, oh, this is kind of wonderful, but I was just a terrible writer. It's a terrible writer. I was getting C minuses. And in French, you know, I was doing pretty well because I had an ear because of my mother, but as we started reading literature, nobody could write well. You know, everybody wrote poorly. So I'm saying all that as a way to say, you stick to it. Eventually that leads me to feeling more comfortable writing in English, but even as a very pragmatic, professionally, a very pragmatic example. So Black Cloud Rising, I have an agent who I think is maybe the ideal agent I would ever dream to have. He was the 151st agent I queried. I told myself I was going to give myself query letters to sort of get an agent to represent the book. I told myself I'd give myself 50. It took Jack Kerouac 50 before they landed on the road. I got to 50 and I'd gotten enough positive feedback. I'm like, I'll do another 50, but 100's the limit. I got to 100, again, some positive feedback, but nobody was accepting it. And so I'm asking myself this question, am I a failed writer? And I keep querying whatever, not a failed writer like I can't write, but there's no audience for me. I'm asking myself, there's no audience. I'm querying, I get to 150 and a small press is interested, a very small press, a good press, but a small press. And we had this weird sort of, like, we're moving forward towards them publishing it. I'm not querying anybody. We're moving forward towards them publishing it. And we had this weird sort of contractual disagreement where it felt a little bit like I was self-publishing. Like I was putting so much into the publication of this novel that it almost felt like I was self-publishing, and I wasn't looking to make money or even advance, but I wanted like the sales to at least give me an opportunity, you know, to break even. And we just could not agree. So at that point, I'm like, maybe I'm not a writer at all. Nobody's ever going to read it. And just, I was so sort of hurt and broken up. I just decided I'm going to query a few more. And I stumbled on this website by a guy who was a screenwriter in California and had a terrible experience and was really angry and had come across the email addresses of all the agents you can't query. They just don't make their emails available from the big agencies, William Morris, ICM, whatever. And I was like, what do I have to lose, you know? And so I queried the man who's currently my agent at 151, and he responded in a couple of days. And he was like, I'd like, because you sent a chapter. He's like, I'd like to read more of the manuscript. That small press came back to me at the same time, and they were like, listen, we can work this out. But all of a sudden I'm like, what do I do? So I contacted him. I was like, listen, I've got somebody else interested. Can you read it fast? This was on a Friday. And he was like, I was like, can you read it by next week? He was like, give me 2 weeks. I was like, okay. By the end of the weekend, he was like, I love this novel. 151 later, right? 150 people rejected it. And it's basically the same novel. Like, he didn't give me these great revisions. So I think you just got to get thick skin, and you got to take the rejections. And if this is what you want to be doing, you just got to keep pushing forward. You know, I'm 58 years old. I started doing this when I was 22, and it's been a long haul. I'm rambling now, and I don't want to, you know, we're past 8 o'clock. I don't want to keep.
Well, two things. Now your book is actually getting nominated for awards, and you also share an agent with Charles Fraser, correct? Old Mountain. He's a North Carolina writer.
I share a publisher with Charles Fraser, but I share an agent with Jupiter Lahiri and Jonathan Lethem and some good folks.
All right.
So, people I respect.
So yes, I want to close, if I may, with a comment from Linda, who's in the house. She says, I share expatriate living in other cultures and the keen need to travel widely to explore many more. Over time, I've come to understand Americanness to me as an outgrowth of culture, race, gender politics, economic status, socialization, and deep beliefs based on strong ideals created, even in the midst of keeping others down to ensure many could achieve them. An imperfect culture, but one with strong roots in improving and moving toward being worthy of those ideals. Imperfection with lots to grapple with, but also with the work of many to open eyes, ears, hearts, and minds. Thank you, Linda.
Yeah.
America is imperfect, but it is also a realm of possibility.
The fact that we are here, the fact that we are doing what we do, when we're writing about it, we're talking about it, that's the sign of hope. We're people who care. We are invested in our Americanness, our identity, in our society. And so to me, that's, yeah, I think, Linda, you summed it up very well.
Yes. Thank you. Sorry.
I'm going to jump in right here and thank David and Deonna.
Thank you all.
Wonderful discussion tonight. We have recorded this session and it will be available on YouTube. If you have people you'd like to refer it to, give us a couple of days to edit the video. And I posted the link for Scuppernong Editions, which is where you'll be able to find the link in a couple of days if you want to send other people this way to look at the discussion. But thank you, David, and thank you, Deonna. It's been a really wonderful evening. I appreciate it.
Thank you all. It was really fun to have this conversation. And thanks y'all for joining us. So.
Yes, thank you.
Good night, everyone.